All right, so today we are covering the training patterns. And when we're talking about exercise or resistance training, it's really important to make sure that we're just not playing or working to our strengths each time. I think there's a big issue when it comes to training when people go into the gym or they go out and exercise. They only do the things that they like to do, and that's great. We want you to do that, but it's really important to make sure that we have a well-rounded approach to training. And I think the reason why a lot of people don't do that, have that well-rounded approach, is because there's kind of confusion as to how should I train, how should I exercise. So this presentation is about training your natural movement patterns to make it easier for you to select exercises and exercise. We don't want you to waste a bunch of time in the gym. We want to make sure it's fun and it's very effective for you. So the way we're going to break it down is I want you to imagine your body in terms of a tire. And so you kind of have this tire here on screen, and at each point here we have a different movement pattern. So the main movement patterns what we have is upper body push. So your upper body push pattern. Some exercises, examples of the upper body push pattern are, well, one is a push-up. It's a very basic progression and should be one of the first exercises that you learn how to do. The second, or a more challenging exercise, might be an overhead press. Now you're pushing in a different direction, but it's still an upper body push. And going to a more technical exercise would be the barbell bench press, or even, dumbbell bench press would be a little bit easier. Okay? So opposite of an upper body push, you have an upper body pull. Now, upper body pull pattern, there's a lot of different actual exercises within it. Here's just a couple exercise examples. First one, a suspension row. So if you had a couple straps hanging from a bar, you could pull yourself up. That would be an upper body pull exercise, and pretty basic that we could progress easily. Next, bent over row. So still doing a row, we're just doing it in a different way. You could use a kettlebell or a dumbbell. It doesn't really matter. You could even use a barbell. The challenge is going to increase with the load that you're using, and also the type of row that you're doing. And an even harder upper body pull exercise would be a chin-up. So this is a vertical pull, but chin-up pull-ups are probably some of the harder exercises to do, but one of the benchmarks that we eventually want to get to. So we have upper body push. Opposite of upper body push is upper body pull. Then we have lower body push. So lower body push exercise examples. The first one would be, can you do an air squat with your own body weight? If you can do an air squat with your own body weight, maybe another progression is adding a little bit of weight to it, and we call that the goblet squat. So if you just held a dumbbell or a kettlebell in your hands and you drop down into a squat, you're adding more resistance. Next, we have a barbell front squat. Now this one, it takes a lot more technique and is a little bit harder, and you can obviously load this a lot more with a barbell, and it's just another example of a lower body push exercise. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of exercises out there that we can do. These are just examples. Opposite of a lower body push is your lower body pull. We also call this the hip hinge. Now some examples of just doing a lower body pull is, can you bend over properly without rounding your spine or locking your knees out? Are you bending through the hips? That's why we call it a hip hinge. Or are you bending through the back? We want to make sure that you do that properly before you move into a harder exercise. Moving on, adding a little bit more resistance could be a kettlebell deadlift. Now all you're doing is loading that weight, loading that pattern up a little bit, and making it a little bit harder. From there we can go into a barbell deadlift. Again, just being able to add more resistance. Okay? So you have upper body push, upper body pull, lower body push, lower body pull, and at the center of this tire, right? So center of any tire, you have to have strength, like a rim. So one way we want to make sure that all these patterns are strong is, do you know how to create stability and tension in your body? If you do, that's great, because you're going to get stronger and you're going to mitigate any risk down the road from pain or getting hurt. And some exercise examples of this are, one is just the plank. It's probably the most well-known exercise. Also probably one of those most butchered exercises that we see a lot of people doing wrong and causing a little bit more dysfunction than they need to. Now, I have static next to that, which means is we want you to be able to create tension statically or still before you do dynamic stability. And you guys already do dynamic stability every day. When you walk, when you move your hands, when you move your legs, automatically that midsection, that core, has to stabilize. The dead bug is just a more challenging exercise with a fancy name that provides a little bit more resistance or a little bit more stability as you're moving. All right? The last pattern that we want to look at is your ability to carry things. And you guys carry things all the time. If you go grocery shopping, you know, you're carrying 2 bags of groceries in your hands. That's what we call a farmer carry. If you're carrying a suitcase down in the airport, that's a suitcase carry. If you're holding something overhead while you're walking, that's also a pattern that we want to work. So very dynamic, and it's kind of has a lot of these other components to it while you're doing the loaded carries. So if you understand these patterns, it's really easy to start putting exercises together or exercise programs together. But we first want to make sure that you kind of have a hierarchy of how you can select some of these exercises. And the first thing that we're going to look at is, do you have the requisite mobility? That's number one. Are you capable? Do your joints go into the ranges of motion in these patterns? If they do, that's fantastic. Then we can start to look at stability. Do you have the requisite stability to get stronger? If you don't have the stability, then we need to kind of give you some exercise selections that provide you with a little bit more stability before we progress heavier and heavier and heavier. Going back to the mobility, if you don't have the mobility to do a pattern, it doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, if I don't have very good hip mobility, then loading you up with really heavy barbell front squats wouldn't make a lot of sense. You might be more inclined to do something like a goblet squat or an air squat that allows you to give you a little more counterbalance just to get in position while kind of adding in more mobility work. Now, after 1 and 2, we also want to make sure that we're looking at alignment, because if you're not aligned properly, that might tell us that, hey, it might look like your mobility, you don't have much more mobility or stability, but maybe you're just not aligned properly. And that just comes back to teaching you how to do something correctly or putting you in the appropriate position to succeed. Hopefully this is all making sense. Now, everybody's probably going to be a little bit stronger in some of these patterns. And so that's important to know too, is because just because I give you all these options doesn't mean, going back to do you have mobility, stability, or alignment, doesn't mean that the hardest option is the right option for you. And you could be stronger in certain patterns than others. So if, let's just say, your starting point for the lower body push pattern is a goblet squat, but you don't know how to hip hinge, learning how to hip hinge would be ideal for you than loading you up with weight. So if you kind of compare these two, right, on a scale, you're stronger in the lower body push, you're, for lack of a better word, weaker in the lower body pull, then that wouldn't be a very symmetrical tire, right? You'd have a more inflated tire on lower body push and a less inflated tire on lower body pull. Moving on to some of these other patterns, you notice like bent over row, like you're pretty strong in the regular row, but the bent over row is your kind of ideal starting position, and you're starting back on the push-up. You don't have a lot of core stability here on the lower body push. So you see that not all of your patterns are even, and if that's the case, we kind of call that a flat tire. And if you have a flat tire, you can drive on that flat tire, but you're setting yourself up for maybe dysfunction down the road. All right? And then we kind of look at the plank. There's a starting position for a plank and, loaded carries. This just gives you some context to see that everybody's going to be a little bit different in certain patterns, and we want to just be aware of that so we can start where you are. Okay? Now moving on to some ways to program this is, let's take a look at some sample session order. And so an option A would be, can you work your weakest pattern to strongest pattern, right? So if we went back to that sheet, if you were weaker in certain patterns, let's start with those patterns to allow you to get more focus and energy on them, and then each next exercise is going to allow you to work that strength, right? So if your plank is your weakest, let's start with the plank and create and teach the body how to go to tension. Then move into deadlift. That's your next weakest pattern. Into upper body push-ups, going into bent over rows, moving into goblet squat, and then a suitcase carry. And the reason why I like this weakest to strongest idea is that it keeps the focus on higher quality for patterns that are lacking. If you get into these later patterns then and you're tired, you're not going to be able to put as much focus into those patterns. All right? Another option is to alternate upper body and lower body. So it's kind of the same thing, same but different. If you look at this list, we have a lower body pull, which is just doing that deadlift first, and then we superset that with a lower body push, moving to a lower body push. So right, upper, lower. Then we move to upper body pull. Then we move into plank, which is we consider a push. And then finally the carry, which is more of a pulling exercise. Okay? Same but different. And this alternating lower and upper allows muscle groups to rest while you're working opposing muscle groups. And this is fantastic for circuit training. If you're trying to get a lot of work in a little amount of time, just cycling from one exercise to the next allows you to get a little bit more work in while you're resting the rest of the body, right? So there's certainly are other ways to train the body and work your sessions, but I hope this gives you a little bit more context and understanding that you can go into any scenario, and if you understand the patterns, you can be in a gym, you can be in a hotel room, it doesn't matter. If you understand the patterns, you can work them all the time with just different exercises. So think about that, put that into play, and when you're going to exercise next time, think about these movement patterns, and if you're hitting all the main movement patterns, upper push, upper pull, lower push, lower pull, you can easily put together a training session with very little effort, and you get a lot of work done in a little amount of time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. This is just a good starting point for you as far as concepts to understand in training.